in Yorkshire, and I have some fragile Wi-Fi, and I have some fragile 3G. So I'm hoping that with a a good wind, we can get through this hour. But if ever there was a session that could be upset by fate or weather or the situation in which Jews find themselves in, then it is this medieval period. Spoiler alert, this isn't going to be enormous fun. There is a famous history of the Jews, the first kind of great history of the Jews by Heinrich Gretz, who is known as perpetrating what was called the lachrymose theory of Jewish history, that it's a series of tear-inducing moments. And the medieval period is so much that, but, and we'll see this as we move backwards and forwards in this hour, huge difference between the experience of Jews living under Christianity, effectively in Northern Europe, and the experience of Jews living under Islam, effectively across Northern Africa and into the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, Spain's relationship between Christianity and Islam is complicated, but we'll just be watching that as we go through today. As in the last couple of weeks, I'm going to be looking first at a kind of a chronology of the whole period, and then I'll be dropping into specific issues. And I've got a slight kind of focus on matters English for us this evening, but here we go. One other thing that just struck me as sort of interesting to me, at the very least, even if I'm afraid it's less interesting to all of you as we go, is that the amount of years that I want to try and get through this week are shorter than last week, which in turn was shorter than the week before, which in turn is shorter than is longer than next week. So it's interesting. I think that's just my focus of being a modern, but we'll see. So where are we in round about 1000? I've suggested that it was better for Jews under Islam than it was under Christianity, but it wasn't so great under Islam. Just dropping it into this kind of sort of experience of Jews in the Fatimid Empire. This is the experience of Jews living through the sort of caliphate, forced to wear a heavy wooden golden calf, while Christians wear a large wooden cross and wearing black hats. So we are kind of singled out and very much sort of forced to identify ourselves. And interestingly, golden calf, fascinating. Anyhow, back into Spain, massacring of the Jews in Cordoba, which was a hugely Jewish city, and Jews fleeing the city. 1016, Jewish community of Cairo and Tunisia, forced Jews between conversion and expulsion. Don't think that it was great for Jews under Islamic dominion. Back up into Northern Europe, just going to start picking up some of the key names in terms of Rabbinic Judaism. I'm not really talking much about Rabbinic Judaism today at all, but just when we talk about Rashi, when is Rashi writing? End sort of back half of the 11th century, the commentator par excellence. Also, round about this period, you've got these kind of Christian crusades. I went to a Catholic school growing up, and the way that I was taught the Crusades was sort of shiny paladins, all splendid and God-fearing, against swarthy, dark infidels in Jerusalem. I'm going to be talking about the experience of Jews in the way of a crusade, leaving from Northern Europe, Western Europe, this country among others, and heading down towards what they would have called the Holy Land. Wasn't a good time to be getting in the way of a kind of religiously led military campaign. Are religiously led military campaigns ever good news? Longer question. 1135, again, another one of these kind of dominant figures. You've got Maimonides. Maimonides, born shortly after Rashi dies, doesn't really seem to know Rashi, but those are the two kind of, huge figures of this period. There should be a line drop in there. 1190, 150 Jews of York killed in a pogrom known as the York Massacre. I am in Yorkshire as we speak, so I've been there. And by 1290, Jews are expelled. And this is going to be one of the real refrains of the experience of Jews in certainly Northern Europe, right the way through this kind of period. What's happening? Usury is getting banned, and if usury is banned, the Jews get banned with it. Some of these things will be known. We'll have a brief look at two English moments in Jewish history this week. But it's not true that Jews have always been welcomed in England. And into the continent, continually being expelled, readmitted, buying licenses of protection. Jews in Western Europe would wander around with letters written by local lords guaranteeing their safety, because you really weren't safe at all without that. And then Poland. So, by the time we get to the end of our period today, the vast majority of Jews living in Europe are in Poland and countries that we would kind of associate with Poland, the Pale of Settlement. Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Russia, far off to the east, having been progressively expelled through Western Europe, heading into this into that direction of Poland. By the time you get to the back end of the 15th century, the launch of the Spanish Inquisition in Spain, and that is again, a Catholically driven idea. The really interesting piece about the Spanish Inquisition was not that it was directed against Jews, but what was called New Christians, Jews who converted from Judaism to Christianity and still kind of professed things like keeping kosher or turning up in church on a Sunday, but then doing strange Jewish things on Sabbath. And that was what really kind of like ironed the Catholic leadership in Spain, and Jews were expelled from Spain. Joseph Caro gets caught up in that, right? Born in Spain, expelled in 1492. 200,000 Jews are expelled from Spain, and Joseph Caro ends up in Sfat in the north of Israel. We had a member now made Aliyah who was very much associated with the Jewish community of Sicily. But look at the extraordinary numbers. Like, I didn't realize that 137,000 Jews were expelled from Sicily. That is almost as many, it's well over half the number of Jews that were expelled from Spain, which is such a dominant idea, I think, in our experience of Jewish history. 1496 from Portugal, from many Jewish cities. Not all expulsions happened. Italy was definitely a place where Jews could live with relative security, again under a kind of Roman Catholic dominion, but you do start to get experiences of printing of Jewish books, shortly after the invention of printing, back end of the 15th century. The Bomberg Jewish press, very famous. The Venetian Ghetto, the first Jewish ghetto in Europe, 1516. I'm not talking, I'm afraid, about any of these, I think, hugely interesting areas of Jewish history. You get legal civil organization of Jewish communities in this Vad Arba Aratzot in Poland, Jews getting together to manage Jewish affairs, a kind of Jewish parliament, the levying of taxes, a representation to the civil, the Polish governmental world. Fascinating. And then this extraordinary figure of Shabbatai Tzvi, and the extraordinary figure of Baruch Spinoza, in two very, very different directions. We'll pick up on some of these threads next week when we get into the modern period. What are the two threads? One, a kind of ecstatic, messianic, it's quite a dangerous, spiritual, vibrant sort of Judaism stroke pseudo-Judaism, fake Judaism, that's Shabbatai Tzvi. And then the other one is, and I don't think it's quite true to talk about Spinoza as someone who was anti-Jewish. He was just very much kind of engaged in academia, scholarship, the world of the university, philosophy, the love of knowledge, and that led him to places that were out of keeping with orthodoxy, with the way in which Judaism was at the time. And we'll see both of those next week. So just sort of like hold on to those two next week. But as we get to the end of this kind of period, the end of the 17th century, lots of Jews living in Poland. 4% of the total population of Poland, but in some areas well above 50%, very, very Jewish areas. And the worldwide Jewish population, 750,000, 450,000 in Poland. I mean, enormous concentration in that area, but it wasn't great in Poland. So the Kalmaniki massacres, 65,000 Jews dead. I mean, it's staggering to even sort of imagine. What is that? That's 1 in 8 of the Jews of Poland massacred, with another 40,000 fleeing. I mean, just awful. And we'll pick up on some of those kinds of rhythms next week when we look at the what happens with destruction visited on Jews, to a Jewish attitude towards being governed by somebody else. So we're setting up, as we get to the end of this medieval period, some of the themes that we'll see when we get into the modern period next week. And they're obviously, I'm just kind of alluding to a sort of Zionism and the decision that really, the Jews needed a land where they weren't living under somebody else's dominion. And then the last thing that I'll be talking about today is the readmittance into England by Oliver Cromwell, 1655, 1656 maybe. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to the end of our time together today. So, that is our span. I want to move not in a strict chronology, but I'll be bouncing backwards and forwards. I'm going to start with England and finish with England, and we'll wander around some other areas as we go. I want to start with 1173. This is an extract from an extraordinary book, The Life and Miracles of St. William of Norwich, written by Thomas of Monmouth, a monk who was both a troublemaker and also, I think, duped himself. He's writing of the experience of William. Who was William? William was a 12-year-old boy who was discovered dead. And this is the first example of what becomes known as a blood libel. What's the story? William is working as a skinner. He's staying in Norwich, right? So Jews who are settled there and required their cloaks or their robes or other garments, whether pledged by them or their own property, to be repaired, preferred him before all other skinners. Just one thing just to kind of catch here. When Thomas of Monmouth is talking about the clothes that Jews had, he's talking about clothes that have been given to them as sureties for the money that they were lending to somebody, which have then been forfeit, right? So, if you need money, you go to a Jew, because Christians aren't allowed to lend money at interest. So therefore they don't. So therefore you go to a Jew who lends money at interest, gets the surety, but then if you default on the property, you're left with clothes. So they need these clothes repaired, because presumably they're going to be sold, they're going to be liquidated for cash on the default. And they go to William. Why do they go to William? Either because he was guileless and skillful, right? So that if he said he'd fix it by, Tuesday and do a nice job for you, he really would. Or because attracted to him by their avarice, they thought they could bargain with him for a lower price. And so here we start to recognize some of the kind of classic modalities of anti-Semitism that we know, through time. The Jew is the money grabber. And now comes Thomas of Monmouth giving his own opinion as to why the Jews singled out this poor boy William, or as I rather believe, because by ordering of divine providence, he'd been predestined to martyrdom from the beginning of time. In other words, God wanted this thing that is to happen to be visited on William. So, none of this, says Thomas of Monmouth, is in any way accident. It's absolutely destined by God that the Jews should behave this way. On we go. This boy was led like an innocent lamb to the slaughter. That, of course, is a reference to a verse both in Isaiah and in Psalms. which talks about being led as a lamb to the slaughter. But what happens to him? He was treated kindly by the Jews. He's kidnapped, and first they look after him, and he is ignorant of what was being prepared for him. He was kept till the morrow, but on the next day, which in that year was the Passover for them, after the singing of the hymns appointed for the day in the synagogue, so shacharit, the chiefs of the Jews suddenly seized hold of the boy William as he was having his dinner, and in no fear of any treachery, ill-treated him in horrible ways. Looking after something before you, spoiler alert, kill it. That's, of course, what happened to the Paschal lamb in ancient times, that it was held and looked after before it was eventually killed. For whilst some of them held him behind, others opened his wound and introduced an instrument of torture, which is called a teasel, and fixing it by straps through both jaws to the back of the neck, they twisted it in such a way as to cause him pain. Now, this has, of course, no corollary in any Passover anything, right? A, you don't attack human beings. B, you don't torture anybody, let alone a human being. I mean, the whole idea of torturing is strange. And they fastened this teasel with a knot as tightly as it could be drawn, but not even yet could the cruelty of the torturers be satisfied without adding even more severe pains. And there is a sort of like a bloodlust that Thomas of Monmouth is painting, that the Jews experience. They're absolutely excited about causing pain to this poor child. Having shaved his head, they stamped it with countless thorn points and made the blood come from it horribly. Well, that is probably a reference to the crown of thorns that Jesus wears. Here you see an illustration. This is in this church. I mean, some of us will have heard Rabbi Roderick Young talk about this. So the blood came from it horribly. The wounds they made were so cruel and were so eager to inflict pain that it was difficult to say whether they were more cruel or more ingenious in their tortures. It's just extraordinary and constructed from nowhere, right? Was William found dead? Yes. Was he found dead? Mangled and beaten up? I don't know. Possibly. I'm not sure. But was it Jews? Just like meaningless as an attack. Thus, while these enemies of the Christian name were rioting in the spirit of malignity around the boy, some of those present adjudged him to be fixed to a cross in mockery of the Lord's passion, that's Jesus, as though they would say, even as we condemned the Christ to a shameful death, so let us condemn the Christian, so that uniting the Lord and his servants in a like punishment, we may retort upon ourselves the pain of that reproach which they impute to us. And the logic of this, aside from the fact that it's absolute nonsense, the logic of this is torturous. That I don't know. It seems to be suggesting that the notion that the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus, is I think fairly well known. But what is going on here is suggesting that we crucify somebody else, so that when we are attacked for crucifying Jesus, we'll take more of that, please. In other words, bring against us Jews. Thomas of Monmouth has the Jews, as it were, saying, as they, don't, but, are perceived to be killing William. Bring this against us because we want it, you and whose army, as it were. This is a pulling together of anti-Semitic tropes, some of which are religious, the sort of the Jesus-ness of it, the Passover-ness of it, some of which are to do with pecuniary money lending issues, right? That if you need to loan money, who are you going to go to? You have to go to the Jews. You can't go to the Christians. But now you dislike the Jews. Shakespeare, I think, was all over this in the Merchant of Venice, and you can see it time and time again, and particularly in England. This whole usury piece was absolutely what went wrong for the Jews as we were moving up to this experience. Where are we again in terms of time? 1173, Jews were expelled from England in 1290. You can start to feel the way in which we as Jews are being othered, outsided, and rendered in such a way that we are eventually going to end up getting expelled. All right. Yeah. Enough of that. More horrible stuff. A similar kind of a period. This is a chronicle of the first crusade as experienced by a Jew. Now, interestingly, looking at this, right, the first crusade was 1096, and this is a chronicle which is 50-ish years later than that first crusade. That's not an enormously long period of time. But what am I going to suggest? That what we're going to look at is a literary document, but based on a true historical account. And as we get into this, we'll start to see what's going on. This is not obviously a photograph of Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont, but here he is summoning people to go and take Jerusalem back. And that would have been the language that would have been used, right? Interestingly, we don't have the way in which the crusade was actually called from, but can you see there, he emphasized the need for penance along with the acceptance of suffering, and taught that no one should undertake this pilgrimage for any but the most exalted of motives. How does that play out for Jews en route? So, not well. We're going to have a look at this Chronicle of Shimshon, talking about the experience of the Crusaders coming through Mainz. And if you were to draw a line from kind of, Calais to Jerusalem, it would basically go straight through Mainz. It was on the 3rd of Sivan at noon, so this is May time, just before Shavuot, that Imiko the Wicked, the enemy of the Jews, came with his whole army against the city gate, and the citizens opened it up for him. So Imiko, a German noble, led a band of plundering German and French crusaders. Then the enemies of the Lord said to each other, so when a Jew says the enemy is of the Lord, they mean now, of course, the crusaders. Look, they have opened up the gate for us. Now let us avenge the blood of the hanged one. So, when a Jew says the hanged one, that's a Jewish way of talking about Jesus. So they fought each other up to the very gate, but the sins of the Jews brought it about that the enemy overcame them and took the gate. So the Jews are trying to stay safe, but, and this is interesting again, God is right. There is a theodicy at play, literally, theodicy, justification of the divine. It's our sins, says Shlomo bar Shimshon, that is resulting in us being left in this place where we are capable of being beaten by the Romans, by the Crusaders, right? It's not that God doesn't exist or that God has given up on the Jews, but it's that it's our Jewish sins, says Shlomo bar Shimshon, that is leading to this, right? The hand of the Lord was heavy against God's people. All the Gentiles were gathered together against the Jews in the courtyard to blot out their name. And the strength of our people weakened when they saw the wicked Edomites overpowering them. Edom, interesting, right? This is one of the tribes that the Jews experience in biblical times who are not well liked. They misbehave against the Israelites, and they get understood to be the lineal inheritors of Esau, the non-Jew, but also the preceders of Catholicism, of Rome. So, so there are a reference to the sort of the biblical understanding of this was always going to happen. The bishop's men, and that's now the Bishop of Mainz, right? The bishop had promised to help the Jews. So, the Jews who were living in Mainz up to this point thought that they were getting on fairly well with their local Catholic rulers and religious leaders, but now this crusading thing is coming through. They turn around to the bishop's men to say, look, you said that we'd be all right, and the bishop's men are the first to flee, delivering the Jews into the hands of the enemy. They were indeed a poor support, right? When the going gets tough, your thin friends are out of there, right? So you can feel so much of the experience of Jews living in Mainz in a document like this. When the children of the covenant saw that the heavenly decree of death had been issued and that the enemy had conquered them and had entered the courtyard, then all of them, old men and young, virgins and children, servants and maids, cried out together to their Father in heaven, weeping for themselves and for their lives. And they accepted as just the sentence of God. Again, theodicy. This horrible experience is not a failure of God, and it's not a failure of the sort of Deuteronomic system where good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. We must have been strong, say the Jews at this time. Therefore, because obviously in their mind, God is correct, God is just. Let us be strong, they say, let us bear the yoke of our holy religion, for only in this world can the enemy kill us, and the easiest of the 4 deaths is by the sword. This is actually a quote from the Mishnah, and there are 4 kinds of death penalties, and if you are worthy of being killed as a sort of capital offense, the death by sword is considered to be the easiest of them. Let us delay no longer, for the enemy are already upon us. Let us hasten and offer ourselves as a sacrifice to the Lord. So they're going to commit suicide. I've got the sort of the Masada story in my mind, the Gamla story in my mind. It's something, that happens. Now look at this line. Let him who has a knife examine it that it not be nicked. That's a reference to shchita, to the way in which animal slaughter is performed. That you only do animal slaughter with a knife that is not nicked, and you pull it across the carotid artery. So what they're going to do is they're going to offer themselves up as a sacrificial offering in the way in which a sacrificial animal was offered. Slaughter us for the sanctification of the only one, the everlasting, and then let cut their own throat or plunge the knife into their own body. Oh, I mean, I don't mean to make light of this. It's obviously completely horrendous. It's horrific. But I'm trying to be historical today, to sort of read it for what we can understand about the experience of Jews living in this time, the fragility, the fear, the ever-present threat, the way in which Jews are being kind of tossed on a turbulent sea of ebbing and flowing religious fervor in Northern Europe, Catholic, Christian religious fervor, and how dangerous it is. They come into the courtyard, they find the very pious there, our brilliant master, Isaac ben Moses. He stretches out his neck, they cut it off first, and the others, wrapped in their talitot, sat by themselves in the courtyard, eager to do the will of their creator. Again, we're starting to set up, I think, themes which will pick up as we see the rise of Zionism and a rise of kind of Jewish power, which we'll look at, in next week. But this is a first crusade, 10th, 11th century experience. Let me just drop to the bottom paragraph of this. It's pretty rough reading, right? The ears of one who hears these things will tingle, for who has ever heard anything like this? Inquire now and look about. Was there ever such an abundant sacrifice as this since the days of the primeval Adam? Were there ever 1,100 offerings on one day, each of them like the sacrifice of Isaac, the son of Abraham? So here at the end is just this attempt to extract from God that kind of bargaining chip that maybe we recognize from the liturgy of Yom Kippur, when we say in the sort of Zichronot and Rosh Hashanah, remember, God, what Abraham was prepared to do to Isaac. Can we have some of those points too? So here is Bar Shimshon, 50 years after this sort of awful, massacre stroke, sort of elective suicide in the face of immediate death, trying to say, we've got to get some points out of this, God. We know that we're sinning, but don't leave us. Let's do something more fun. Okay, moving from Northern Europe and Catholic dominion down into Cairo, the Caliphate, and Islamic dominion. Just a little meta history, right? That about the experience of history. It's taking us to 1986, when Solomon Schechter, who was the reader of Hebrew at the University of Cambridge, is brought a kind of a scrabble, a handful of documents. I'll show you some of these documents in a second. And he looks at these documents, which were brought to him by these two sisters, these two maiden sisters, Scottish explorers, extraordinary women in their own right, the Lewis sisters. But they show him some documents which they bought in Cairo, and he takes one look at them, and we'll see what he says here. But he says he's going to call on her at about 11 p.m. And this is sort of a note in the Cairo Geniza website. This may be a mistake, since one may question Schechter's intention to call on, I thought she was unmarried. Hey, interesting, I might have that wrong. Mrs. Lewis at such a late hour, perhaps meant 11 a.m., but in his, quote, haste and great excitement, can you see there? You know, in haste and great excitement, he wrote 11 p.m., or maybe like he just wouldn't take time off during the day to go and visit to discuss this. What is going on here? This is one of the scraps of manuscript that Solomon Schechter is shown by these women in 1896. It is a Hebrew version of Ecclesiasticus, also known as Ben Sirach or Ben Sirach. Now, what is Ecclesiasticus? It's not Ecclesiastes. It's not the Book of Kohelet, which is part of the Hebrew Bible. It is a book which post-dates the closure of the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, but predates the New Testament, what Christians call intertestamental. Now, we believe that the Book of Ecclesiasticus was a Jewish written book, but because it was never canonized by Jews, it got lost. It was canonized by some Christian churches, including the Copts, including the Catholics, including the Orthodox, the Eastern Orthodox churches. So we have it in Greek, in Syriac, in Coptic, but we'd lost the original Hebrew. And staggeringly, offered to Solomon Schechter was this manuscript in which he takes one look at it and immediately knows it's Ecclesiasticus. I have to say, let's just nod our head at the impressive scholarship at issue here. I mean, I can't read anything on that. And, you can see there a transcription. Even with the great benefits of skill and everything else, you haven't got much that you can read at all. And of course, Solomon Schechter has never seen Ecclesiasticus in Hebrew. I mean, clearly he had fluent Greek and liturgical Greek, he would have known it. But would you be able to spot this, in a foreign language? Anyhow, in great excitement, off he goes. He gets money from the University of Cambridge and jumped basically on the next ship, goes out to this synagogue where these documents had been found. So this is the synagogue in Infrastat in old Cairo, where at the back of the synagogue, this sort of ladder led up to a sort of a loft space, and into that was thrown, what is a geniza? It's supposed to be a place to hide documents which are no longer fit for purpose, which cannot be thrown out. Classically, Torah scrolls, tefillin, sidurim, things in which God's name is written. Not even, by the way, all God's names. Hamakom, you don't need to put in the geniza. But even to this day, at New London Synagogue, stuff gets put in the geniza which doesn't need to go in the geniza, and you can see. And this is just like a grab of stuff. This is kind of what came out of there. But over the course of 800 years, some 300,000 documents were lobbed into the back of the geniza. And here is Solomon Schechter back in the University of Cambridge with boxes and boxes and boxes of this stuff. And he starts working on it. It is an unbelievable scholastic achievement to work through this and to get it to a point where you can start to understand what's going on. Now, one of the incredible things about it being punked, this particular synagogue in Infrastat, is that this was the shul that this guy, Moses Maimonides, used to go to. So it's his shul, and weirdly, in the Geniza are not only Maimonides, as it were, first editions of Maimonides' great rabbinic works, but also just bits of letters, stuff that should never, as it were, been properly put into a Geniza, but it's just been, dumped in the Geniza. Somebody's walking around the shul, tidying up scraps of paper, and just lobs it over the, through the window at the back. Just dump it there. But look what we're starting to understand by getting this and starting to work at it. Interesting look at the Hebrew. Does it look like classic Hebrew to you? Does it look Arabic in its, in its flow of cursive letters? This is actually a letter written in Arabic. So, I'm not going to be able to decipher it at all. But you can see Moshe bar Maimon, Moses the son of Maimon. There's the signature of this, the great man. I've actually held one of these letters, and they're not all still in the University of Cambridge. There's a good number in places like JTS as well. But, here we are. This is Maimonides, who's written this letter saying, help out this guy. He's an acquaintance of ours. He and his son now owe 2 payments of the Julia. Please take steps to have this paid in your community. What is the Julia? The Julia is a tax that was imposed on Jews as a kind of penance for not accepting, as it were, the truth of Islam. Muhammad as God's preeminent prophet, and this was a lot of money, and it was waged on people as a kind of poll tax, but it wasn't paid as a poll tax. If you were rich, you were expected to sort of pick up large amounts of the Julia payments. But, so what's happened is that Isaac al-Dari has gone somewhere, and as he arrives there, he's got no money at all. One period of time ticks by and he owes 1 bit of tax, and then a second period of time ticks by and he owes a second bit of tax. He's got to find someone to help him pay this tax because he can't pay it himself. So you're really starting to sort of experience life as, inside a Jewish community. Now, the scholarship that's done in the Geniza work is of so many different kinds. There are people looking at ancient biblical texts and liturgical texts and ritual texts, but it's really the stuff that kind of reveals the life of the experience of Jews of the time that is the real kind of historical gold dust. And the great scholar of this is somebody called Shlomo Goitin, who did all of this work. Let me just start on the right. What's this? This is a kid's book. This is how you teach the alphabet. We've got kids' books in here. What's this? This looks like a sheet of amulets designed to protect the bearer from scorpions. So you can see here that there would have been another 4 amulets in the sort of bottom 4 corners, and this thing would have been sort of like cut. Somebody would write out these sort of amulets, and then you would sort of go up to him and you would pay, I don't know, a couple of pounds for an amulet. So what does it say about what Jews believed? What did Jews believe about magic? What were Jews afraid of? How did Jews earn money? Who was this? Is this somebody who is learned or not learned? I can see I'm just keeping a brief on some of the chat. Thank you, Sally. That book, Sacred Trash, is one of, I think, my absolute favorite books of Jewish history. It's the story not only of the Geniza, but also of the scholarship that cracked the Geniza and worked on the Geniza. It's absolutely beautiful. And here, just this letter on the left. This is a letter that is sent from Syria to Egypt, describing what's going on in Damascus. And this is the importance of the Cairo Geniza, is that not only are we learning about the experience of the Jews of Cairo, we're also learning the experience of Jews outside of Cairo. We're also learning more about the nature of medieval life inside Egypt than we have from any other source at all. Because, for example, we have the accounts of the synagogue. How much did they spend on oil to light the lamps in the synagogue? So we know how much everything cost in Cairo. It's an unbelievably rich historical resource. Yeah, and there is Islamic fighting as well, right? So you've got Bedouin tribes, you've got Fatimids, all these things sort of are going on. Just one last piece. No, I'm going to keep moving. You can just see, you can just feel the utter humanity of what happens when you have Geniza documents to hand. I wish to tell you what happened with regards to the Julia. This is that tax since you left. There are many in this city who read before thee, but they are not treated as I have been. Every day they molest me, they summon me to court, ask me to pay the Julia in full. If they want to register me as resident, I wouldn't have minded if others be treated the same way. So you're just starting to realize, like, Jews wandering, merchants coming into the city, leaving the city, being registered as resident with some of the kind of the rights of being able to kind of attend the synagogue on special holy days if you are a resident. This guy's complaining he's being asked to pay without, no taxation, without representation. So you can really feel so many kind of swathes in Jewish thought. Again, I'm not moving chronologically. I'm just sort of moving, I guess, geographically. So we've had a look on the far eastern side of the Mediterranean from Egypt, in Cairo, perhaps in dialogue with some of the local Jewish communities of that time. But now let's come far west into the Iberian Peninsula and just, the briefest of words about what gets referred to as the Golden Age of Spain. I mean, we know comes to a juddering halt 1492, but, and again, going right back early into this period, here is Shmuel HaNagid, a Nagid, the storyteller, but he's a person of political importance as well as of rabbinic importance. But here he is writing poetry, and the interesting thing to me about this poem is quite how un-Jewish, how un-rabbinic it is, right? Take from a fawn the crystal filled with blood of grapes, as bright as hailstones filled with fire. Her lips are a scarlet thread, her kisses wine, her mouth and body wear the same perfume, her hands are crystal wands with ruby tips. She tints her fingers with her victim's blood. Apologies for the absence of an apostrophe there, but a couple of thoughts. Just how unrabbinic is this? Blood, right? A wine goblet. Okay, fine. I understand talking about wine like blood, but hang on, that's really not very Jewish, is it? Right? And then this eroticization of this woman, right? Partly, by the way, slightly infused perhaps by that verse from Song of Songs, kiss me with your lips, your love is sweeter than wine. But this is absolutely massively sexualized. But the woman is dangerous. All the love poetry. I did a course in love poetry in my final year at JTS when I'd just been engaged. I thought it'd be a fun thing to do, but all the love poetry, it's all unrequited. I loved her so much, she abandoned me. You get this sort of continual sort of unrequited moans of this poetry. But the point is, this is inspired by Arabic rules of how to write poetry. There's an incredibly rich and fertile Arabic culture of writing poetry with dominant rhythms and rhymes. We recognize some of those rhymes from some of the liturgical poems that we know very well. Adon Olam Asher Malach. Yigdal Elohim Chai Yishtab. All of those rhythms, they're all makam. They're all coming out of Arabic poetic ways of writing poetry. The rhymes are there. The words that are used are all drawn from the Tanakh. I've shared some of this. Looking at it in the Hebrew with the English, and it's an unbelievably rich poetic liturgical literary tradition. It's Jewish in that it was written in Hebrew, but it's absolutely Arabic in terms of its sheer existence, in terms of the themes. You get themes of homosexual love, you get themes of adoration to camels, things that we've never really seen inside of Judaism, infused by Judaism. So, looking back to what I was talking about last week, one of the things that I was trying to suggest is that there's never been a kind of a pure Judaism that wasn't influenced by its surrounding culture. Judaism is continually being influenced by its surrounding culture. And as the surrounding culture ebbs and flows, as power bases shift, as dominant religious patterns of observance in the surrounding culture shift, you experience that within Judaism as well. So here we have in an incredibly literary, not very overtly religious, by the way, drinking wine, doesn't fly in Islam at all, right? Neither does this sort of sexualization. But it's moving across permeable borders. And Shmuel HaNagid, who was, absolutely as an orthodox and as rabbinic a figure as you would wish to imagine, is part of this interweave of experience between Jew and non-Jewish world. Okay, back to England. It's interesting. I've looked after my timing a bit more effectively today, or I'm just moving quicker. 1654. Where's England? Charles I has been decapitated, and Oliver Cromwell is the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Jews are able to live in Antwerp, and are doing quite well in Antwerp. They are not able to live in England because they were expelled in 1290. That, by the way, is a long period of time ago. Who is Manasseh Ben Israel? I love this. A divine and doctor of physic. A divine, that's a term, that means he's a rabbi. And a doctor of physic means that he is, as it were, a medical doctor also. Oh, I know about that kind of stuff. Rambam was exactly the same, right? That there was no, and this is before kind of germ theory or, double-blind control testing of drugs. There was a sort of a continuum between being a religious doctor and being a doctor of the body and a doctor of the soul. But here he is. And he wants to try and get Jews into England. Jews in England having been expelled and not able to be there. Why exactly? Good question. Manasseh ben Israel is certainly kind of messianic, and we'll see a little bit of that when we get into looking at the text of what's to follow. He also, I think, saw himself as a great champion of the Jews, and I think he would have been what we would refer to in kind of contemporary days as as an Anglophile. I think he just really liked England. He spends 2 years in England. He comes over, he writes this, publishes this humble address to Oliver Cromwell. I'll say a bit more about how it doesn't work when we're done, but he sticks around and eventually actually ends up being awarded a pension of £100 a year, which strikes me as quite a lot of money at the time. I'm not entirely sure. To sort of be around as sort of Cromwell's sort of in-house sort of Jewish expert. But this was written in French, translated into English a long time ago. But let's look at it in the French. And my goodness, this is one of my absolute favorite documents in all of Jewish history. The opinion of many Christians, and mine do concur herein, is that we both believe the restoring time of our nation into their native country is very near at hand. What does he mean by that? Well, what he would call the Messianic period, and what the Christians would call the return of the Messiah. He's saying, we are in an eschatological period. Is Christianity in an eschatological period? You betcha. What happened to that wicked king, right, who, by the way, was the leader of the church? Gone, right? And there is this new Puritan sensibility alive, awake in England. So he's saying, this is coming. I believing that this restoration cannot be before the words of Daniel be first accomplished. Well, that's interesting. He's going to cite to Oliver Cromwell Daniel. He's presuming that Oliver Cromwell knows the Bible well, as I'm sure he did, right? So here we have from Daniel, and when the dispersion of the holy people shall be completed in all places, then shall all these things be completed. Well, that's one of those sort of rather difficult to pin down verses out of Daniel. Got no idea really exactly what that's meaning. But now Manasseh ben Israel is going to tell Oliver Cromwell how that verse from Daniel should be understood, signifying therewith that all be fulfilled. The people of God, says Manasseh ben Israel, us, the Jews, must first be dispersed into all places of the world. In other words, before you get to the Messianic period, Jews need to be spread around a bit. No, now we know how our nation is spread all about and hath its seat and dwelling in the most flourishing parts of all the kingdoms of the world, only except for this considerable and mighty island, Britain. In other words, you, Oliver Cromwell, because Jews aren't in England, we're not in the Messianic period. It's not going to end up happily ever after, and it can't end up happily ever after until the Jews come to England. Just want to point out one other adjective in that last sentence: all the most flourishing parts of all the kingdoms. Oh, hello. Ding, 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 ding. What he's going to suggest, and he'll make it absolutely explicit, we'll see it on the next slide, is that if you let the Jews in, you will do better economically. it'll be much more flourishing for you, right? Jews are in places that do economically well. Is that because we are, I don't know, geniuses or crooks, or the only people able to lend money, which is obviously needed in order to kind of, do well economically? It's a brilliant piece of writing. And therefore, this remains only in my judgments before the Messiah come, right? In other words, says Manasseh Ben Israel, I've been thinking this. The only thing required before the Messiah turns up is that we get the Jews back into England. Now, does he believe that? Is he negotiating honestly, as it were, or is he kind of using this as a sort of as a schmooze? For none hath ever afflicted Jews who hath not been by some ominous italics exit most heavily punished of God Almighty, as is manifest from the history of those kings. I mean, this is just brilliant writing. Pharaoh wasn't nice to the Jews. Look what happened to him. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't nice to the Jews. Look what happened to him. Antiochus Epiphanes, right? Interestingly, a comma has been put in the original between Antiochus and Epiphanius, because whoever was typesetting this didn't realize that Antiochus Epiphanes is one person. It's just fascinating. You can understand transmission history. What happens is these things get published, right? Pompey and others. On the contrary, none was ever a capital B benefactor to the Jews, and cherished them in their countries, who thereupon hath not presently begun very much to flourish, right? So again, it's very, very religious. Manasseh Ben Israel is playing to Oliver Cromwell as somebody who believes that God is there and God loves Jews, and that even though Jews are not in power, God is still watching over us. Sorry, I've just got let me put that down. In so much that the oracle to Abraham, brackets, I will bless them that bless thee and curse them that curse thee, Genesis chapter 18 or 19, right, seemeth yet daily to have its accomplishment. Now this is chutzpah. This is absolute chutzpah, because it ain't so great to be Jewish, right? The Jews are not doing so well, but yet Manasseh Ben Israel dresses up Jews as being just like, oh yes, that, you take one look at Jews and you say, oh goodness, God must be on their side. I mean, it's brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Therefore, I beseech you, for God's sake, right? Not for my sake, not for the Jews' sake, that ye would, according to that piety and power wherein you are eminent beyond others. Little bit of schmooze, doesn't go down badly, right? Again, Oliver Cromwell, taken over from the king who thought that he was the head of the church. Well, I don't know, the king was the head of the church. The way in which the king kind of understood themselves as being a religious person, now gone, right? Now replaced by Cromwell. Vouchsafe to grant that the great and glorious name of the Lord our God, interesting, our God, I think here meaning you, Cromwell, and us Jews, may be extolled and solemnly worshipped and praised by us through all the bounds of this commonwealth, and to grant us place in your country, that we may have our synagogues and free exercise of our religion. I nothing doubting, but that your clemency will easily grant this most equitable petition of ours. Right? Pagans have of old, out of reverence to the God of Israel and the esteem they had to his people, granted most willingly free liberty, even to apostated Jews, as Onias the high priest, to build another temple in their country. Right? I mean, he's showing tremendous knowledge of the later parts of the Hebrew biblical period, just assuming, I'm sure quite correctly, that Cromwell would have known all of this. Like unto that at Jerusalem, how much the more then may we that are not apostate or renegade Jews hope it from your highness and your Christian council, since you have so great knowledge of and adore the same one only God of Israel, together with us. I mean, what an extraordinary piece of writing. And, I have to say it gets better if you get a chance to roll in it, although the language is, it's rich, right? Nobody writes sentences quite like that anymore. What happens as a result of this humble address and the experience of Manasseh Ben Israel in London? Cromwell buys it, and Cromwell sets up a Jewish commission to think about whether or not we can bring the Jews in, and people go berserk. The church aren't very comfortable with Jews coming in because we're still perceived to be, Christ killers. And a lot of the mercantile classes don't like it either, because they're going to have now stiffer competition from Jewish merchants. So nothing ever happens. Then in 1656, this man is arrested, Joachim Robles, and he is arrested on the capital charge of being a Catholic in in Protestant England. And for sure, he's about to have all his goods sequestered from him. And he turns around and he goes, wait a second, I'm not a Catholic, I'm a Jew. Now, this is interesting because, of course, Jews were sentenced not to return to England on pain of death in 1290. So when he, as it were, outs himself as a Jew, he's taking a great risk. He's taking a great risk that the historical illegality of the Jews being in England on pain of death will have atrophied to a point that it's now easier to be a Jew in England and out as a Jew than to be a Catholic. And he gets away with it. He gets his goods returned to him and he doesn't lose his head, literally. And this serves as a kind of sign that it's okay for the Jews to come back. And so, Jews start to come back. They start to build synagogues. They start to purchase land for cemeteries. And where are we as we get to the end of our period, the end of our hour, and the end of our kind of medieval period? Starting to see Jews coming back into, I'll use the word in inverted commas, civilized society, Western Europe, France, Germany, England, that swathe of the country from which they've been expelled and sent off to Eastern Europe. What are we going to be picking up on next week? What was the cost of readmittance? What was the meaning of readmittance? What did Jews do, and what did Jews have to do, and what did Jews want to do in order to be perceived as being part of modern civilized cultural society? And we'll look at that in a number of different ways. We'll look at people who rejected that, people who accepted that, people who were happier to do that, people who weren't happy to do that, and then of course, and that will kind of haunt us as we enter into the modern period. We know that the Holocaust is there, sort of waiting for us. So that is our mere 750-year trip. I'm leaving myself with only 250 years for next week, which will be the last in this 4-part series. For those of you who've been bearing with me, I appreciate your company. And
I was going to say, we can say thank you. Right?
Can I make a very quick comment appendix? In 1956, to celebrate the 300 years of the Jews being returned in the Cromwellian period, there was a huge concert at the Royal Festival Hall in celebration. It was called the Tercentenary Concert. And my father, Martin Lawrence, who was, of course, director at the Shul, sang Bloch's Sacred Service at that concert. We were there, all the family were there. Amazing occasion.
Amazing.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Jeremy. That was
David, great to see you. Thank you so much. Let me just turn off the, Rabbi Natasha, would you mind just turning off the stream onto Facebook? And thank you all very much for